Okay, let's start. Okay, so we're going to go over the history of the USSR in a nutshell. So USSR is the previous name before the Russian Federation came up. So it's the communist sort of state, the nation state, before the Russian Federation was established in 1992. The textbook only covers the end of USSR from like 1980s with the Brezhnev, but then I just felt that it was very, very important to actually know the background of the USSR as a whole, because it's going to come up a lot, and especially if you want to understand what's going on with the foreign policies of the Russia, it's very important that you actually understand what happened during the USSR era. All right, let's start.
Good morning, everyone. So, Stalin and the establishment of the USSR. The Soviet Union was created in 1922 after the Russian Civil War. Lenin became incapacitated in 1922, and following his death in 1924, Joseph Stalin rose to power. Stalin consolidated control through purges, executions, and forced exiles. Under his leadership, the USSR were transformed from an agrarian society into an industrial superpower. This transformation came at a terrible human cost, with an estimated 30 million people losing their lives.
Right, so Russia is still the largest country in terms of the size of the land. And before the establishment of the Soviet Union, they had Russian Empire, which actually comprised of a lot of ethnicities, a lot of languages. But then you have to remember that even though it's a communist country, a lot of people actually mix up Karl Marx, whether he was a Russian or not. But then he was a German philosopher, and he actually just wrote a lot of books on the communism. So it's true that he provided the philosophical sort of background for the communism, but he's not the one who actually helped out establishing the Soviet Union. It was actually the Lenin and Stalin which consolidated their power within Russia, and that's how the Soviet Union was created, a country which was based on the communist socialism. And Stalin is, still infamous, and he actually, to rise to power, he killed a lot of people. He purged a lot of people, and that amounted 30 million people, and this number is actually larger than the number of the Jews who were killed during the World War II. Just combining all the numbers of the Jews who were sent to the concentration camps. So it's not well known as much as the Holocaust is known, but then Joseph Stalin killed a lot of people to secure his power. All right.
Stalin's policies and collectivization. Stalin introduced rapid industrialization through his 5 years plan. He abolished private firms and replaced them with state-controlled collective firms. This collectivization resulted in a devastating famine in 1932 to 1933, which killed between 6 and 8 million people, especially in Ukraine. Stalin also weakened organized religion and promoted Stalin atheism. The Great Purge of 1936 to 1938 saw about 1 million people executed as supposed enemies of the state.
Yeah, so you have to remember the Russian Empire was a agricultural society. So most of the people living there were farmers. So, but then it was Joseph Stalin which actually turned the entire country into a rapid industrialization through collective farming and central planning of all the economies. And of course, because it's a vast empire, and I'm sure that there were a lot of politicians, a lot of people vying for power. And there were a lot of people who were actually opposed to his ideas and his control. So that's why he killed not only the leaders, but a lot of people. He just kept killing and killing all those who opposed it, and they labeled them as the enemies of the state. So in the process, actually the central control of the entire country by a government, by the Soviet Union government, the party, the Communist Party was consolidated, and the original system, as you can see from the communist socialist system, that a lot of other countries actually follow the Soviet Union's model, and that model actually was created as a result of the Stalin's reform, if you could call his reform as a reform. All right.
Principles of communism in the USSR. The USSR adopted Marxism-Leninism, which viewed history as a struggle between the working class proletariat and the capitalist middle class for The ultimate goal of communism was to create a classless society where property was shared equally. In practice, the Soviet Union established socialism through a command economy in which the state made all major economic decisions. Central planning determined what goods were produced, where they were made, and how they were distributed. Agriculture was collectivized, forcing farmers to surrender their land, livestock, and equipment, which led to inefficiency and widespread panic.
Right, so it's very important that there is a distinction between Marxism and Leninism. Versus socialist communism. So Marxism, Leninism, this is a philosophy. And basically argue that the entire labor force is divided between the bourgeoisie. It's actually quite difficult. Z versus proletariat. And proletariat are the laborers, the average laborers, who don't really have the means of production. So say if you're working in a factory, and those with the capital, the owners, the CEOs, they are the ones who actually not only own the capital to run the whole factory, but they actually have the means of production. So say if you're working in a factory, if you're the owner, then you actually have the machines which run the whole factories, right? And the proletarians sort of represent the laborers, the average laborers. And they don't actually own the means, right? Means of production. They don't own the machines. They only have their bodies, right? So the wages of the average laborers is determined by the amount of time they work with their bodies, right? So from the perspective of the bourgeoisie, the people who have the capital and then the means of production, because the machine and the capital, they work regardless of the human condition, right? So if from the perspective of the bourgeoisie, the amount of time the machines and the capital work, if that increases, it's beneficial for them, right? So they try to minimize the cost of the laborers, and they try to hire as many laborers as possible so that they can extract as much benefit as possible from the machines and the capital, right? So that's why during the late 19th, when the Industrial Revolution happened in England, a lot of the bourgeoisie who actually owned the factories, who owned the machines, that they were trying to hire as many people as possible because the more they actually run the machines, the more benefits, the more capital they can create out of the means of the production. So that's why they started like hiring all these kids as well, because the wages of the kids and the woman is actually cheaper, right? And then they found it very profitable, so what they did was they started colonizing. Because if they were to actually build the factories and if they were to run the factories outside England, actually the wage is a lot cheaper. So a lot of people actually argue that the Industrial Revolution is linked with the colonization process. It was actually driven by the motivations of the bourgeoisie because they wanted to make as much profit as possible. So Karl Marx came in. He was a German philosopher who migrated to UK because he had a very good friends who supported it. Karl Marx was very poor because he's a philosopher, but then he had a rich friend, Engels, who was in English. So he actually, Karl Marx moved to England. He saw all the conditions of this child laborers, how much, the working conditions of, all these child laborers. And he criticized a lot in his books. And that's how Marxism came about. It was to support this, child laborers, this like horrible conditions of the conditions of the laborers, But then this is different from the socialist communist system. Socialist communism is a system which runs the country. And socialist communism is actually made by partly sort of by Lenin, because he was a politician, but mostly it was actually the original model, the prototype of the socialist communism was actually made by Stalin. A lot of other countries, including China, North Korea, all these communist countries, they followed this model of the socialist communism, right? But the prototype of running the whole country, the country's economy, politics, administration, it was established and consolidated by Joseph Stalin, because he's a politician, right? So it's very important that you guys actually distinguish between the Marxism, Leninism, and socialist communism. It's the philosophy, and it's a sort of socialist communism is a state system, okay? Right, so as you can see, socialist communism, it's a system which runs the country, has distinct features, as the PPT says, is actually characterized by central planning. So when you run the country, if you were to have the capitalist society, capitalist market, then you actually just leave whatever is done in the market. It's actually run by the interest driven by the people participating in the market. That's the definition of the capitalism. Whereas socialist communist economy, basically the government plans centrally. How much goods they will produce, according to their expectation of of the import and export, and who's going to be involved in the production of these goods, and and after how many goods are produced, how they will be distributed across the country. So the process of production is basically is defined by the central planning, and that was applied to the agricultural field as well. Because as you can see, Russian Empire, before the establishment of the USSR, the Soviet Union, was an agricultural society. So a lot of these farms owned by the people were taken away from them, right? And then the government centrally started owning all the land. And then they actually built the Central Bureau, which controlled the production of the agricultural goods out of the lands. So and that whole system is called collectivism. Okay. So collectivism and socialist communism, central planning, these are all the state apparatus to run the country. So it's important that you guys actually distinguish from the Marxist philosophy. All right. Okay, so after Joseph Stalin actually ruled for more than 10 years, almost 20 years, for a long time, but he was actually ill at the end. So he wasn't killed, he wasn't assassinated, but he just died. And afterwards, there was a new leader, Khrushchev. And his policy is pretty important as well. So let's have a look.
Khrushchev and Soviet foreign policy. After Stalin's death in 1953, Nikita Khrushchev became leader of the Soviet Union. Khrushchev introduced a policy of de-Stalinization, which reduced political terror and eased censorship. His foreign policy focused on Cold War competition with the United States in areas such as the nuclear arms race, and the space race. Khrushchev faced major crises, including the building of the Berlin Wall in 1961 and the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962. Despite these changes, he maintained central planning and collectivized agriculture.
Right, so Khrushchev actually maintained the central planning and the collectivization of all the agricultural goods and the means of production. But then he's different from Stalin in that he was trying to stay himself away from Stalin, because as you can see, Stalin killed so many people. So Stalin had a lot of enemies within the Soviet Union. So he was trying to curry favor with those who were opposed to Stalin as to consolidate his power basis. So he started this process of de-Stalinization. So Stalin was almost made like an idol within the Soviet Union, but the Khrushchev, after he came to power, he actually started breaking away from the legacies of the terror politics of the Stalinism. So he was trying to be more lenient in terms of domestic politics, but then still, when we read the primary documents last class, the whole sort of foreign policy approach during the early 1960s, during the 1960s and 1950s was called containment. And containment basically describes you try to contain the sphere of influence of the Soviet Union within its land, because the American politicians, American diplomats actually viewed Soviet Union as being very expansionist. It was trying to expand the sphere of influence. It was trying to not colonize, but it was trying to establish the puppet government in a lot of countries which became independent out of the colonization. So in terms of foreign policy, the policy of containment still continued, but there was a change within the domestic political scenery in the USSR, because Khrushchev was trying to distance himself away from Stalin. All right, so and then there is a change of mood, and this word détente is very important. You guys have to remember this word, okay? Détente. Okay, let's read it.
And the Cold War. The Cold War was a global rivalry between the United States and the Soviet Union from 1945 to 1991. This competition did not involve direct war between the two powers, but was fought through proxy wars, espionage, and arms races. Eastern Europe was divided from Western Europe by the Iron Curtain, and Berlin itself was split by the Berlin Wall. During the 1970s, a period of emerged which reduced tensions through arms limitation, talks, and cultural exchanges. They also opened the door for agreements such as the strategic arms limitation talks, increased trade between East and West, the greater diplomatic dialogue, although underlying ideological rivalries remain unresolved.
Right, so under the policy of containment, the US and the Soviet Union, they didn't actually fight directly, but they actually supported the governments in the developing countries, in the countries around, so that these governments, especially nation states, the newly formed nation states, became pro-Soviet Union or pro-US. And so a lot of conflicts actually were done in those countries that were either supporting or the United States or the Soviet Union. And that's what's called proxy wars. And it's going to be evident in terms of so there's a lot of conflicts going on within the Middle East, and it's linked with these proxy wars that occurred during the Cold War. And of course, I think the biggest sort of conflicts occurred in Europe, and as you can see, the Western Europe, which was sort of under the influence of the US and also protected by NATO, that bloc was formed, whereas the Eastern Europe, which was close to the Soviet Union, it was under the sphere of influence by the Soviet Union. But as you can see, until like 70s and 80s, the dividing line was not as adamant. I mean, the people were able to like cross, the borders, and then the relatives, if you have family members living like in a different sphere of influence, I mean, you could still go there and then like communicate. But then as the competitions between the Soviet Union and the United States intensified, the border control was sort of intensified, and then, so it's important that you know that the rivalry between the US and the Soviet Union actually sort of drew, what kind of influence these small countries, not only a small country, but the European countries and a lot of newly formed nation states received. So there was this period of sort of intense competition, it's called the containment, until like early 1970s. But then Khrushchev, he was trying to distance himself from Stalin, but he was also trying to make up relations with the US and the other countries, including the sphere of influence over there, because as you can see from when we were doing the presentation about the geography of the Russia, a lot of the land is actually very frozen, and then it's very cold. So it's not a good climate to actually grow a lot of crops. So there was always the shortage of the food, because it's not very favorable for farming, a lot of the land, So the Soviet Union wanted to import a lot of grains from the other countries. And for that purpose, it was better for them actually to have good diplomatic relations. So Khrushchev and then other leaders, they were thinking, maybe we can have, we can open up the relations with the West so that we can actually import more of the grains from outside, and then we can export our minerals and our precious metals. So trade began, and the improved relations between the Soviet Union and the US is called detente. All right, so it's important that you guys understand what this term is. Okay, detente is a period of improved relations between the Soviet Union and the US, and containment policy is an intensified rivalry between the two states. Okay. All right, so let's have a discussion on these 5 questions with the people next to you. If you can't find, can you go there? And then, yeah. So we have 5 questions. I mean, you don't have to discuss all the questions, but then you can actually just pick and choose 1 or 2, and then you have a discussion for 3 minutes now. Yeah, so I'm just gonna when you actually revise it, I'm gonna upload it today.
Number 4.
Do we have Nahid? Nahid, please, Nahid. Alright. Arafat. Arafat, please. Google. Sorry.
Even though the Soviet Union was tried to be kind of really friendly with the US, but the US's policy was never containment of the Soviet Union, it's the expansion of the
So some of these questions will be on the exams, and this is a revised PPT, so I'm just going to upload it in the LMS today, okay? All right, we don't really have enough time. We have so much to cover today, so let's move on.
Leonid Brezhnev became the dominant Soviet leader in the 1970s and promoted stability over reform. He introduced the Brezhnev doctrine, insisting that the Soviet Union had the right to intervene in other communist states. Brezhnev's economic policies emphasized heavy industry and agriculture, but inefficiency and corruption spread widely. Party officials and elites enjoyed privileges while ordinary Russians struggled with poor living standards.
Right, Khrushchev, after he was put down of the power, another leader whose name is Brezhnev came in. So it was marked as the improved relations between the Soviet Union and the US, but after Brezhnev came in, he had a slightly different stance from Khrushchev. So he said that we actually have a right to intervene in the affairs of the other states. Actually by establish public governments or by controlling the leaders of this country. So it was sort of a change of stance in terms of the foreign policy. But Brezhnev was trying to hold a very tight rein on the foreign policy. But then domestically, Soviet Union started having a lot of problems because if you were to have a central planning, what if there's a famine? What if there are so many different factors that can change, that affect the planning for the economy. So if you were to just just leave it to the market, individuals will have the incentives and motivations to change according to different climates or different things that have occurred. But then if the government is in control, what if you have a drought? So all these contingencies can affect, how many goods of the specific good and the other goods, the number of the goods produced. But because the government is so huge, and people are actually trying to avoid responsibilities if everything is done by central planning, because they can actually blame their leaders. Okay, I was just ordered and I have to produce this amount of goods, and I just did whatever I was told. So people had an excuse to avoid the responsibility for the failures. So they started having all these problems because they had everything. Not everything, but then they had this huge government system which was trying to control all the economies and all the means of production and stuff like that. But in addition to that, in addition to the inefficiencies that came out of the central planning, the leaders of the Communist Party, they started indulging themselves too much in a way. So they started having all these problems of corruption. But because the media was controlled by the government, the news about this corruption by the privileged elites, the privileged leaders, was blocked. But then people came to hear more about those corruptions happening within the government. So they had all these doubts about what was going on within the government. So domestically, a lot of problems began to emerge. And it's very important that you remember what was going on domestically, because I think this was the main driving force which actually established the Soviet Union as a country. All right, whose turn is it?
So during the 1970s, the then reduced Cold War tensions along some cultural and trade exchange with West. In 1979, the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan ended dependent and a united East-West hostility. The United States, under President Carter, responded with grain embargoes and by boycotting the 1980 Moscow Olympics. In the 1980s, US President Ronald Reagan called the USSR an evil empire and began a major military buildup.
Right. So Afghanistan is still a country fraught with a lot of conflicts, and that began during the Soviet Union and the U.S. Rivalry. So they had an improved relationship for 10 years. Especially during the 1970s. But then the Soviet Union, under the leadership of Brezhnev, decided to invade Afghanistan. He wanted to establish a pro-Soviet leadership within the Afghanistan government. That propelled U.S. to sever the improved relationship with the Soviet Union. So Soviet Union was able to import grains from outside because they always had a shortage, but then the U.S. decided to block the trade. And also it's important that President Carter, he belongs to the Democratic Party in the U.S., but then President Ronald Reagan, he's from a Republican Party. So normally Republican parties, have more sort of conservative and ultra sort of patriotic stance in terms of their policy. So when Ronald Reagan came in, he started calling Soviet Union as an evil empire, which is very undiplomatic in a way. You don't actually call the leadership of the other countries as evil. It's almost like they personify, in a way. So they started. The mood was improving, with the period of detente, with more trade coming in. But because of this stance, because of this invasion, especially in Afghanistan, the mood suddenly changed. All right, it's very important that we remember Gorbachev. He's the leader which actually changed the whole direction of the Soviet Union. Okay, whose turn is it?
Mikhail Gorbachev and Perestroika. Mikhail Gorbachev came to power in 1985 and immediately called for radical reforms. His policy of Perestroika, or restructuring, aimed to introduce elements of market economy with limited private ownership. He also introduced glasnost, or openness, which encouraged freedom of speech and reduced censorship. For the first time since 1918, elections were held with multiple candidates, creating new political freedoms.
Right, so after Brezhnev, Gorbachev came to power. And because the Soviet Union had a lot of problems domestically, there was a problem of a lot of corruption within the party officials. And also, because of the central planning, a lot of inefficiencies, the economy was basically in downturn. And Gorbachev wanted to reform the whole system by opening up, So he started having this restructuring, I think it's called perestroika in Russian, and it tried to introduce market, market competition in a limited sphere. Not the full-scale market system because it's gonna, crumble down on the whole system. But he was trying to give a limited private ownership to people, so that maybe when you have a farm, if you were to if you were to have a private farm, then it actually gives you more incentive to work harder. So he started allowing a private ownership in a limited sphere, and also in terms of the freedom of speech, in terms of media, he actually gave some rights for the media to speak out, so that he was intending to actually clean the corruptions within the government by opening up the freedom of speech, but not in the full scale. He wanted to do it in a step-by-step manner, but it actually turned out in a very different way from what he had expected. So I gave you this primary source. This is actually some of the primary sources that were written by Gorbachev, and we're going to actually read it together because his role is very, very important. All right.
political reforms under Gorbachev. Gorbachev followed non-communist parties to form and remove the Communist Party's guaranteed leadership role. In 1990, he created the position of president, becoming the first and last president of the Soviet Union. His political reforms encouraged independence movements across Eastern Europe and the Soviet republics. Ironically, the reforms weakened the state rather than strengthening it, making cops more likely.
Right, so you have to remember that it was a very much centrally controlled government in terms of economy, but much more so in politics. But he actually decided that, okay, we have only had just one party, the Communist Party. But from now on, I will allow other parties to come up and to be created. And these parties can produce their own leaders. And these leaders can compete for the seat of president. So he created this new position, the president of the USSR. But then you'll see, he actually did all these reforms with a very good intention, but things happened actually almost the opposite of what he had expected. All right, whose turn is it?
The end of the Cold War, Gorbachev introduced a foreign policy known as New Thinking, which reduced military spending and aided support for Eastern European regions. In 1987, the United States and the Soviet Union signed the INF Treaty to eliminate intermediate range nuclear missiles. Eastern European nations were no longer backed by Soviet troops, and peaceful revolutions overthrew communist governments. In 1990, East and West Germany reunified, and symbolizing the end of the Cold War.
Yeah, so not only domestically, he actually gave a free rein by creating all these other parties. So he was trying to diversify the domestic politics, but also in foreign policy-wise, he actually reduced the support for the pro-Soviet regimes outside, especially in Europe. So a lot of countries in Eastern Europe, Poland, Hungary, Ukraine, these countries, they actually, the leaders of the governments of these countries, they were able to sustain their power with the support of the Soviet Union, right? But then because the support was diminished, and basically Gorbachev said, okay, from now on, I'm going to reduce the spending on you so that we can focus on our domestic politics and economy. So, in those so far in pro-Soviet regimes, other politicians which were vying for power, they actually had an opportunities to overthrow, right? So that actually advanced all this drive for independence, right? So Gorbachev actually wanted to do it in a step-by-step manner, but the things happened just really in the full scale, not only domestically and in the foreign policy-wise. So as a result of it, in 1, 2, 3 years, all these countries and all these republics, they actually said, okay, we're gonna turn away from Soviet. We're gonna go away from the influence, and we're gonna be more independent from you guys. So they actually started establishing more independent government, elect more independent government. So the scenery, the political scenery in Europe was changed very rapidly. Okay.
The collapse of the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union diverse population included 92 nationalities and over 100 languages, creating deep divisions. Nationalist movements in Georgia, Latvia, Estonia, and Lithuania pushed for independence in 1989 and 1990. In 1991, hardline communists attempted a coup against Gorbachev, but Boris Yeltsin rallied resistance in Moscow. By December 1991, Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus declared the Soviet Union dissolved, and Gorbachev resigned.
Right. So you have to remember that Russian Empire, Russian Federation, Soviet Union is a vast country. So it actually includes 92 nationalities and more than 100 languages. So they had a lot of small republics. Actually, the Soviet Union, USSR, actually combined all these small republics, which included many different nationalities, ethnicities, and languages. So since Gorbachev sort of gave a free rein to a lot of politicians, not only domestically, but in other nation states, other regimes. Actually they made an agreement amongst themselves that they were going to be independent. And within Soviet Union, Gorbachev actually had a coup against himself by the hardline communists. Because if you were to think about the communist leaders, because of Gorbachev's reform, they lost all their privileges. Until the time they enjoyed all this privilege from the closed system. But because Gorbachev actually had this whole reform, their power bases crumbled. So the hardline communists, they revolted against Gorbachev, but the revolt was actually succeeded by Boris Yeltsin, right? So as a result of all this happening, actually the leaders of the Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus and other regimes, which were a part of Soviet Union, they declared independence around this period. And that's when the Soviet Union actually collapsed, as a nation system. And of course, they have Russia as a country. So they actually went back to Russian Federation. So you guys have to remember that before 1912, before the Lenin, it was a Russian Empire, and then they had a Soviet Union, USSR, and then after 1991, 1992, they had a Russian Federation. Okay. All right, so these are the critical thinking questions that you guys have to think, but I don't think we'll have time to discuss, so I'm going to upload it. Some of the questions might come up in the exam, so you can think about those questions. All right, whose turn is it?
Boris Yeltsin became president of Russia in 1991 and pushed for a rapid transition to a free market economy. His shock therapy reforms caused economic hardship, inflation, and unemployment for many citizens. Organized crime expanded and social inequality deepened during the 1990s. Despite challenges, countries like Poland, Hungary, and the Czech Republic moved closer to NATO and the EU.
So with the establishment of the Russian Federation, the first president was Boris Yeltsin. So he wanted to actually open up the economy more, but he was actually planning to have a shock therapy. So he wanted to have this reform all done very quickly, so that they can actually transition into a more sort of efficient economy. But then his attempt failed. So there were a lot of hardships and a lot of confusions within the people. The economy basically dwindled, and there was so much confusion politically. So people became really dissatisfied, and there were more crime. The crime rates sort of skyrocketed. So it was a period of a very harsh transition for Russia, for Russian Federation. And also a lot of countries which were under the influence of the Soviet Union, they became independent. But then, not only that, they actually tried to become members of the NATO, under the influence of the US. And still, this is very important, still, Poland and Hungary, Czech Republic, they were under the influence of the NATO. But Ukraine, it was trying to join the membership, but then it fails, so it still lingers. And that's why, they were actually the leader of the Ukraine. He was trying to join NATO, and that's how the war broke out, between the Ukraine and the Russia. So it's important that you know the historical background about, what had happened. All right, and this is important as well. Okay, whose turn is it? Chechnya.
Muslim majority region attempt to secede from Russia in the 1990s. Yeltsin used military force to suppress independence, leading to brutal conflict. Violence in Chechnya continued into the 2000s with terrorist attack and severe destruction in capital Grozny. The conflict highlighted the difficulties Russia faced in managing its diverse population.
Right, so Russia is the biggest country in terms of this, the size of the land. I mean, this this is very rough. But then in border, this is like North Pole. Sort of there's a tiny country, Korea, and it borders Middle East. So there's this country, Georgia, and here like Middle East and Africa. So Chechnya is in this borderline, you know. So there are several little republics bordering Russia and then the Middle Eastern countries. And you can see Russia, when we do the geography, we're going to cover the religion. The dominant religion of Russia is Russian Orthodox. Orthodox Church. So it's Christianity, right? But people living in this region, they're sort of part of Middle East. So people actually, their predominant religion is Muslim. So there are a lot of conflicts here, not only because they're ethnically different, but religiously they're more like Middle Eastern than European. So Chechnya, they had a lot of terrorist groups, and they're quite hardline. They wanted to become independent from Russia more so than other ethnic groups, and their beliefs are very much based on their religious beliefs, right? So it started creating a lot of problems, and it's still going on. And it's still going on with Putin. So you will actually hear a lot of news related with this region when you hear the foreign policy of the Russia nowadays. Okay, Putin. Whose turn is it?
So the rise of Vladimir Putin. In 1999, Boris Yeltsin resigned and Vladimir Putin, a former KGB officer, became president in 2000. Putin introduced reforms to stabilize the economy, including tax cuts and land sales. He sought to reassert Russia's global role and applied for membership in the World Trade Organization. Putin's leadership strengthened the state, but critics argued it came at the cost of democratic freedoms.
Right, so Putin came to power after Boris Yeltsin. So Yeltsin had a lot of problems, and he actually failed to control all the problems that occurred as a result of the transition. Right? But then Putin, you can see from his personal background, he used to be a KGB officer, a secret police officer. So he actually knew how to control the government and the politics. So in terms of politics, he was very much in control of the media, but then he tried to adopt the capitalistic sort of competitions within the economy. And partly it succeeded, and also it gave a lot of the previously government-owned companies to individuals, actually individual entrepreneurs, and they became the commercial elites, So there are some of the oligarchs which are in charge of which own this few companies within Russia, but it's actually not government owned. Those companies are not owned by the governments, but owned by these economic elites, and they actually succeeded in garnering a lot of investment from outside. So Moscow was very much stagnant during the communist era, but then with the coming of Vladimir Putin, he actually attracted a lot of investment in Moscow. So Moscow became one of the richest cities, capitals in the world under the leadership of Putin. So I have good Russian friends, and I actually find it really surprising that they regard Putin very highly. They say that the country became really stabilized economically, and people actually live off from the wealth. It's not as the gap between the rich and poor has been increased, but overall quality of life has been increased under the leadership of Putin. So a lot of Russian people actually highly regard Putin because he actually stabilized the economy. All right, whose turn is it?
Putin and Chechnya.
Putin pursued a hardline policy in Chechnya, intensifying military efforts to bring it under Russian control. Rebel groups became more radical, and some were linked to Islamist movements. The Baseline School seized in 2004, which killed over 300 people, shocked the world, and hardened Putin's stance. Putin increased central government power, restricted media freedom, and tightened control over Russian politics.
Right. So Putin's stance was very hard line towards Chechnya because, as I told you, there are little republics which were under the control of the Soviet government. And if the Russia gave independence to Chechnya, a lot of little republics, they want to become independent, right? So that's why Putin, the Russian Federation, refused to give independence to Chechnya because they envisioned that a lot of other small republics and ethnic groups, they want to become independent. And this region is very important. As you can see, Russia has a very big land, but a lot of the land is frozen. So when you study geography, you'll see that the region which is called the Siberia is huge. It's actually bigger than the whole United States, but most of it is frozen. So for Russians, the land on the southern front is very important, because it provided ports, unfrozen port, and it provides access to a lot of different markets. So the roads to Middle East, to Europe, the southern area is very, very important. That's why Moscow, the capital, and St. Petersburg are very much like towards the Western Europe, So the eastern part very much neglected, and this area is very important for the Russians. All right, conclusion.
The decline of the Soviet Union reshaped the global politics, ending the Cold War and creating new independent states. Gorbachev reforms the perestroika and the glasnost introduced the freedom, but destabilized the Soviet system. Yes, the free market reforms brought both opportunities and hardship to post-Soviet Russia. Under Putin, Russia regained stability and global influence, but democracy weakened under stronger state control.
Right, so we just went over the history of the USSR in a very brief sort of time. It's important to remember those details, especially like the terms, because it actually helps you to understand what's going on in the region. The war, the Ukraine-Russian war, why it happened, and also a lot of conflicts in the Chechnya and in this region. Okay? All right, so let's read this primary source. These are the primary documents of Gorbachev. And we're going to see what kind of stance he had. All right, okay. Does anybody... All right, whose turn? Oh. Does it, everybody have it? Okay. All right, source one, Gorbachev, a nuclear war. Can you read it?
Gorbachev on nuclear war. In his book, Perestroika, published in 1987 before the collapse of the Soviet Union, Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev argued that nuclear warfare is senseless. The fundamental principle of the new political outlook is very simple. Nuclear war cannot be means of achieving political, economical, ideological, or any other goals. Nuclear war is senseless. In irrational, there would be neither winner nor loser in a global nuclear conflict. World civilization would inevitably perish. It is suicide rather than a war in the conventional sense of the word.
Right. So nuclear entrees, I didn't actually I can explain this in detail because it has a lot of details as well. So, but you know the World War II ended, especially in the Far Eastern Front, with the bombing of the nuclear weapon bombing in Hiroshima and Nagasaki in Japan, right? So that's how the U.S. won the war in the Pacific region, right? So afterwards, with containment policy coming in by Soviet Union and the U.S., they wanted to build up their military capacities, and of course, Soviet Union invested a lot on the hard sort of hard power. So they invested a lot on developing weaponry, and they started building all these great scientific satellites and rockets, and in addition to them, they started using their technology to build up a lot of nuclear weapons. So there was an arms race between the Soviet Union and the U.S. to build more advanced nuclear weapons. But as you can see, Gorbachev, he is a pacifist. He's still alive, and all the other Soviet Union leaders passed away. But you can see he's internally he's pacifist. You can see from his view. You can use this document. So he was opposed to the arms race because he saw it as the end of the human race. The nuclear arms race continue, and you never know what's going to happen. The evil leader came in and he just presses the button. So there's actually a lot of worries with the development of the AI. So if the AI actually surpasses the human intelligence, and if the AI can make its own decision, then it can actually press the button of the nuclear weapons to destroy the whole human race. So this is actually a big threat of the AI discussion nowadays. All right, let's read.
A way of thinking and a way of acting, based on the use of force in world politics, have formed over centuries, even millennia. It seems they have taken root as something unshakable. Today they have lost all reasonable grounds. For the first time in history, basing international politics on moral and ethical norms that are common to all humankind has become a vital requirement.
Can you read on?
There is a great trust for mutual understanding and mutual communication in the world. It is felt among politicians, it is gaining momentum among the intelligentsia, representative of culture and the public at large. And if the Russian word perestroika has easily entered the international lexicon, this is due to more than just interest in what is going on in the Soviet Union. Now the whole world needs restructuring. For example, progressive development, a fundamental change.
Yeah.
We are all students and our teacher is life and time. I believe that more and more people will come to realize that through restructuring in broad sense of the word, the integrity of the world will be enhanced. Having earned good marks from our main teacher, life, we shall enter the 21st century well prepared and show that there will be further progress.
Yeah, so you can see from his document, he's an idealist. So he really believed that if he were to restructure himself, his people, and his own country, then the other countries will follow. So he was a very idealist politician. He sort of thought the same for the other people, but actually his idealistic sort of vision failed. So a lot of problems occurred. But then you can see that the Soviet Union actually collapsed as a result of his idealist vision. All right, source 2.
Source 2, Gorbachev's Communist Party. Gorbachev spoke to the Central Committee of the Soviet Communist Party on February 6, 1990, about the future of the party in the Soviet Union.
Right.
The main thing that now worries communists and all citizens of the country is the fate of perestroika. The fate of the country and the role of the Soviet Communist Party at the current, probably most crucial stage of revolutionary transformation. Of no less importance is the understanding of the fact that the party will only be able to fulfill the mission of the political vanguard.
Vanguard.
Vanguard. If it drastically restructures itself, masters the art of political work in the present conditions, and succeed in the cooperating with forces committed to perestroika.
Yeah. Continue.
The platform says our ideal is a human, democratic socialism, expressing in the interests of the working class and all working people, and relying on the great legacy of Marx, Engels, and Lenin. The Soviet Communist Party is creatively developing socialist ideals to match present-day realities, and with the account for the entire experience of the 20th century.
Right, so I told you that there's a difference between the socialist communism as a state apparatus versus Marxism and Leninism, okay? So Gorbachev heavily believed in Marxist communism. So you have to remember this democratic socialism. So democratic socialism is actually implemented in a lot of Northern European countries. So they actually claim that they are like socialist countries. So a lot of expensive welfare states, they get a lot of taxes from the people, very high rate tax, and very extensive welfare state. So through the government system, they're trying to equalize the wealthy, the people who have the capital and the machines, the means of production, and then the neighbors. So democratic socialism, this basically is based on it's a system, it's a government system based on the Marxism, Leninism. So you can see that Gorbachev wanted to sort of go back to the roots of the Marxist Leninism, away from the socialist communism, which is characterized by hard grip of the whole economy and politics by the government. Okay, can you read on?
The platform states clearly what we should abandon. We should abandon the ideological dogmatism that became ingrained during past decades, outdated stereotypes in domestic policy, and outmoded view on the world revolutionary process and world development as a whole. We should abandon everything that led to the isolation of socialist countries from the mainstream of world civilization. The party in a reviewing society can exist and play its role as vanguard only as a democratically recognized force. This means that its status should not be imposed through constitutional endorsement. The Soviet Communist Party intends to struggle for the status of the ruling party, but it will do so strictly within the framework of the domestic democratic process by giving up any legal and political advantages, cooperating with other social and political forces, always working amid the masses living by their interests and their needs.
Right. So he was trying to democratize the whole political process by embracing more diverse groups to voice out their opinions. So that's why he actually liberalized the political parties. But and he believed in the communist victory. So according to Marxist Leninism, they actually believed in the victory of the proletariat. They believed that that's the revolutionary process, of the world history. So at the end, the proletariat will actually win. So they really believed that it was their worldview. So Gorbachev actually wanted to sort of uphold the Marxist ideals, and he wanted to see, by democratizing the process, he could actually see the power handed over to the working class. But always ideals different from what's really happening in the world. All right, so we went over the history, we went over the documents. So you can see that Gorbachev, it's a very important figure. So if you were to remember Gorbachev and Putin, and I just listed out the important Russian leaders. So I actually learned all of this in one semester. So, but then we just went over it like one hour. So in the second half of the class, we're going to do the geography of Russia. I think it has some history as well, so it's going to be fun. So we have Shanawaz and Abdullah. Yeah, you get prepared, okay? All right, let's have a 5-minute break.